Hi everyone. As Alex said, my name is Mike McLellan. I'm a director in the cyber intelligence cell within the counter threat unit. And the focus of this session is going to be on how we look to use orchestration and automation to help our research activities scale. We have somewhere north of, I think, 5,000 clients at current count who face a range of different threats across different verticals and different geographies. So for us, one of the things we have to look at is how do we scale our research activity to make sure that we can free up researcher time to focus on the hard challenges and try and automate things that are repeatable and predictable and those kind of things. And one area where we can look to do that is around threat indicators or indicators of compromise, as they're often known. These are, as I think we all acknowledge, not necessarily the most valuable in terms of detection and countermeasures, but they do have a place within a kind of a suite of controls. And I think it's important that we are providing as much of that to our customers as we can, particularly where we can identify indicators before they're used. So actually being able to deploy things to customer-facing controls before threat actors to start to try and use them in those environments and really help to try and detect threats as they start to manifest. I'm going to focus on Cobalt Strike as a kind of case study of how we've done this and how we've orchestrated the extraction and dissemination of indicators. The reason for focusing on Cobalt Strike basically is because it's one of the most prevalent threats we see. When we look at our network intrusion detection system alerts for the last 12 months, we can see that Cobalt Strike is a front runner, both in terms of the number of clients, but also the total number of alerts that we've seen across that customer base. As I'm sure you'll be aware, Cobalt Strike is a commercially licensed tool, often known as an offensive security tool. It's sold to red teams to conduct security assessments. Unfortunately, it's also obtained by a large number of threat actors for network intrusions, and we continue to see it in a number of the engagements that we work. I've highlighted a couple of others on that chart as well, which are also offensive security tools for PowerShell Empire and the Metasploit framework, both also OSTs as they're known, but Cobalt Strike is the one that we see and hear talked about most often. So that's the one that we've sort of focused on for the purpose of this case study and for a lot of the automation work that we've done. We've also seen Cobalt Strike in something like 19% of IR engagements this year, so it really is a really prevalent threat. And one of the reasons for that is that it is so well equipped. It's a well-designed, fully functional post-exploitation toolkit. It's the kind of Swiss Army knife or Leatherman of the post-exploitation framework world. It can do pretty much anything you want, so that makes it very attractive to threat actors. It's also attractive to threat actors because while it is commercially licensed, it is fairly trivial to obtain. So even if you're not going to pay for it, you can get cracked copies off forums or off the internet, and you can use those. That makes it obviously appealing to a number of actors. There's no development cost because the tool is being developed commercially by health systems who sell it, and therefore, if you're a threat actor, you can get hold of this tool, use it without any of the cost of developing your own malware or anything like that. So it's a really attractive offer to those actors. It's designed to be covert. It's obviously built to be hard to detect and constantly being developed and iterated to make it hard to detect. So that again is of interest. And if you're concerned about OPSEC, then it's also hard to attribute because we see so many Cobalt Strike installations out in the wild that it can be very hard to differentiate between different clusters of activity and work out who's responsible for the activity. So a number of reasons why Cobalt Strike has become so popular with threat actors, and it remains the real kind of stable framework that we see commonly used. Fortunately, when it comes to combating Cobalt Strike, we're not starting from a completely cold baseline. So we do have access to the tool. We have an adversary group who conduct red teams. They have a copy of Cobalt Strike, which is properly licensed. So we have the ability to test against it. We can make sure that our countermeasures are as good as they can be. When it's customized, Cobalt Strike remains incredibly hard to detect for pretty much any control, but we can work as hard as possible to try and make sure that we can detect it in as many kind of scenarios as possible. When Cobalt Strike is not particularly customized, when it's used in a sort of default configuration state, it's also quite easy to find. So one of the advantages we've got with Cobalt Strike is that where threat actors are being quite lazy about how they implement it, we can actually identify instances of it in the wild, command and control servers, that kind of thing, and we can start to detect these things proactively, and that's some of the stuff that I'll talk about as we go through. And we have a wealth of data to hunt in, so we have a lot of client telemetry where we can see Cobalt Strike running on customer networks. We've also got external data sets that we can use to go out and query internet scan data, that kind of thing, to try and find Cobalt Strike installations. So lots of data we can go hunting to try and help us combat this particular threat. When I talk about detection opportunities, there's sort of two types I'd highlight. One is behavioral and the other is reputational. When we talk about behavioral countermeasures and detections, we're talking about identifying Cobalt Strike based on the way it operates rather than on specific indicators like domain names, IP addresses, that kind of thing. So we've got network signatures. So the top image you can see there is an intrusion detection system signature for our iSensor appliances. It's designed to capture traffic where Cobalt Strike is using the Wikipedia malleable profile. So one of the things Cobalt Strike can do to hide its network traffic is what they call malleable profiles, where the network comms can be designed to look like they're going to a legitimate site like Wikipedia or Amazon or wherever. We detect aspects of that, so we can write network signatures and detect it on the wire. We can also develop host-based countermeasures, as you can see in the bottom screenshot there, and we've got literally dozens of countermeasures written to detect Cobalt Strike both on disk and in memory. And we can use those again to identify it based on the way it operates rather than specific characteristics of how it's doing that. So these behavioral countermeasures are really important. They give us the longer term, more enduring detection. We spend a lot of manual effort making sure those countermeasures are as good as they can be. And one of the great things about the Taegis platform is it allows us to bring together those countermeasures into a single view. So as a customer, you can see how your controls are performing both at the network and host level. So this is an example of just some of the alerts from the last few days for Cobalt Strike across our entire customer base. And even here, you can see a mixture of third-party, so Microsoft Defender detections, a TDR watch list, which is our intelligence and our logic applied to the streaming telemetry, whether that's from host agent or elsewhere. And then NIDS watch list, which in this case I think are Cisco firewalls that are detecting the Cobalt Strike DNS beacon traffic. So, you know, Taegis is really great for us as researchers and as network defenders, as analysts, to be able to go into and look at these detections across different kinds of controls and be able to kind of correlate them all together. So, really powerful for us there. The second set of detection opportunities are around reputational detection. So, as I say, Cobalt Strike, when configured in its default state, is signaturable. There are things you can look for, and there's lots and lots of work being done that's out there on the internet about how you can do that. Organizations like the UK NCSC have published some really good guidance on things you can go look for, and we can do that. We can go out and look for those command and control servers, and we can start to pull out those indicators and try and get them in front of clients as quickly as possible. Ideally, as I say, before the threat actors have actually had a chance to try and use them. So we can look for things like the default Cobalt Strike TLS certificate, and we can search platforms like Census to find that. We can look for default ports and the HTML hash for Cobalt Strike team servers. We can look for JARM hashes, which is the SSL handshake, the sort of concept that Salesforce developed. We can look for all these things, and we can use that to identify potential Cobalt Strike C2 servers. And once we've done that, we can start to pull that data in and try and process it. We can also look for malware, so we can use systems like VirusTotal to go out and find Cobalt Strike samples in the wild. We can pull those down, push them into our sandbox technology, which we use heavily use the Cape sandbox for that. And we've got parsers that will then extract the config from those Cobalt Strike samples and make them available to us. So again, we can focus on the infrastructure, or we can focus on the samples, and we can, through both methods, we can pull out indicators we can use to try and protect our customers. Getting the indicators is one thing. That's relatively straightforward. The challenge for us and any other kind of threat intelligence shop is how do you then process that stuff in a way which is efficient and fast, because moving data around takes a lot of time if it's done manually, and it's probably going to be too late to be of much use by that point because indicators obviously decay relatively quickly as a detection. So we need to look at how we can orchestrate and automate this to make our ability to process that data as efficient as possible. And the way that we do this is through our threat intelligence management system. For those who attended the summit in 2020, Chris Taylor did a great presentation of TIMS, our threat intelligence management system, and talked through the various aspects of it. In this context, we're using the workflows, and this is a kind of set of JavaScript-based workflows that we can use to do data processing and perform a whole range of different tasks. It's designed to be a sort of drag and drop model, as you can see on the right-hand side, where you drag blocks of JavaScript code onto workflow, plumb them all together, and then tweak them a bit to do what you need them to do, and then you can run those workflows, and the kind of data gets pulled down and processed in accordance with how you configured them. So we can set up workflows that are fully automated. They effectively run headlessly, so researchers can set them up, set them to run, and then can basically leave them, and they will go and do their job on a recurring basis, and we can set them up as kind of cron jobs to run periodically. We can use them to go and get remote data, both from internal data sets and also external, so we can query our own client telemetry. We can also query external data sets. I talked about Census and Showdown, domain tools, those kind of things. We can query all of those using these workflows. And when it comes to some of those external data sets, we have effectively kind of scheduled jobs that run. They'll go out and run particular searches. So here you can see a few examples from Showdown and Census, looking for default Cobalt Strike installations out in the wild. That will pull back effectively a list of IP addresses amongst a whole lot of other data that we can then parse out and process. So we can use these workflows to go and grab that data. We can then normalize it, deduplicate it. If we want to, we can wash it against other data sets. So we can take external data from some of those recurring searches of internet scan data, wash those against client telemetry and kind of enrich them that way. We can perform triage, so we can apply logic to the indicators as they flow through the system and make sure that we're pushing good indicators to our customers, because we find out very quickly if we push bad indicators, and our SOC will quickly notify us if they're starting to see ticket blood. So it's important that we're able to triage these things in an automated way and set the threshold for that logic. And then finally, we can expose the indicators to downstream consumers via a REST API that we've built that goes on top of this. And the TIMS platform was built by a company called Ripjar, based in Cheltenham in the UK, but we've heavily customized it, obviously, for our purposes. And these workflows are all written by researchers to meet particular use cases that we've got. So we end up with this kind of automated ecosystem for Cobalt Strike, where TIMS sits at the center as the orchestration piece for it. But we're pulling network indicators from infrastructure fingerprinting that I've talked about from systems like Census and Showdown. We're grabbing Cobalt Strike beacon samples, so we get those from public repositories like VirusTotal. We also get them from our own endpoint telemetry, so where customers are running our RedCloak host endpoint agent and we have inspector rules running, they will actually identify Cobalt Strike running in memory, dump out the memory, and then extract the Cobalt Strike implant from that memory dump. And all of that, so those samples plus the dumped memory, all get pushed into CAPE, our sandbox technology, where we can do config extraction, normalization, and that data then gets pushed into TIMS. So TIMS is the kind of focal point for all of this data that's been pulled in without any real researcher interaction at all. It's then being processed, normalized, triaged, and then pushed out as indicators in near real time. And obviously, we can also use it to identify opportunities to improve countermeasures if we think that we're seeing particular samples that behave differently, or we're seeing changes in the infrastructure that's being used. So this kind of automated ecosystem is what we're using to feed a lot of our downstream consumers like Tejas to make sure that they have the latest threat intelligence and threat indicators that we can generate for them. I mentioned triage, and that is a really important step for us with this stuff. There's no point having automated workflows that just push data blindly to downstream consumers and expect customers to make sense of it, because we will quickly find out if customers are finding that actually they're having to turn our feeds off because they're providing low value or no value. So triage is really important for us. Cobalt Strike is a really good example of that, because it can use a number of techniques to try and evade detection, which can create risk for you when you're just blindly processing indicators. So to take an example, this is a Cobalt Strike sample in VirusTotal. You can see from the behavioral activity that its network request is to Forbes.com. So when running a sandbox, that would be the DNS request that you would see. And if you were a network defender looking at logs, that would be the DNS request that you would see this malware make. But when we actually extract the config, we can see that while www.forbes.com is configured as the command and control server, the host header holds a different value. So in the HTTP request that would follow, the host header field would actually have a different host in it. And that is ultimately the one that Cobalt Strike is using for command and control in this case. And the way that this works is through something called domain fronting with high reputation domains. So essentially, Cobalt Strike is using Forbes.com as a kind of high reputation domain that would pass any kind of check in terms of looking for suspicious domains, and is using that to then route traffic through to the actual command and control server. And the way that it does that is through, as I say, domain fronting using content distribution networks. So Forbes.com, like lots of other sites that are out there, is actually backed off onto the Fastly.net CDN. So when a request is sent to Fastly's infrastructure, it actually ignores the original DNS request and will send the traffic to whatever the value is in the host header. So by using these CDNs, these content distribution networks, Cobalt Strike can send traffic that looks entirely legitimate, looks like Forbes.com, but the actual traffic is going somewhere else. And as you can see from the network capture for that sample, this is what you would see in a packet capture to the DNS request followed by a HTTP session, which is actually going elsewhere. It's being redirected by Fastly to the actual server. So that's one way that Cobalt Strike can evade detection. For us, it obviously means that we have to be really careful about what indicators we're pushing, because if we push Forbes.com, we will quickly find out that customers are getting irritated by the number of alerts that they're seeing. So we apply indicator triage to make sure that we are weeding out things that shouldn't be pushed to downstream consumers. So we can look at the context of the indicator. Is it phishing? Is it command and control? Is it opportunistic cybercrime or something more targeted? What does that tell us about how often we should be seeing this and in what context? Have we got any history with this indicator? Have we allow listed it before? Have we decided previously how we're going to deal with it? Can we use that historic decision making to inform how we deal with it now? We can wash the data across external data sets. So we can look at things like top 1,000 domains, or we can look at whether an IP address is hosting hundreds of domains that might indicate shared hosting. These things can all be decision inputs to help us decide how we process an indicator and part of our sort of triage logic. And we can look across historic client telemetry across all geographies and verticals, looking for things like sudden change of use. So if infrastructure suddenly starts to be used for scanning rather than command and control, we can also look for vendors pushing out threat indicators, because we then see a spike in appearances in our customer telemetry as things start getting added to security controls and that sort of stuff. So there's lots of logic we can use to triage these indicators and make sure we're only pushing things that are useful and they're really going to provide value for customers. And as I say, we're really trying to avoid that situation of creating lots of false positives for our customers. I think one of the reasons that we do this, as I say, is to free up research time so that we can go and look at some of the so what's, try and make sense of the data we've got, look at some of the insights we can gather, rather than being focused on generating indicators. And we really want to try and free up that research time, generate efficiencies. And this is a good example of where we can do that and use the data we're generating in the process to actually make sense of what we're seeing. So this is an example from February or March this year, I think it's February, where we saw activity on a customer environment where a threat actor was downloading a reverse TCP shell from GitHub and was using a pre-configured IP address that you can see on the screen there, so 45.76.202.203 for command and control. So we've got this activity. Clearly, someone's trying to gain access to that machine and try and do something on it. One of the things that we do when we see this kind of activity is we will wash the indicators we find across all of our other data to see if we've seen that in any other context and help us to try and maybe make sense of it, maybe attribute the activity, try and figure out why the customer has been compromised to what end. In this case, when we run the IP address through our customer telemetry, we can see a number of Cobalt Strike samples, the run back, in this case, a few weeks or a few months. And when we look in more detail at the configuration of those samples, we start to see some commonality. And one of the things that was common to a number of the samples communicating with that IP address was the watermark that we were seeing used. So the watermark is essentially the license that's given to it a particular version of, or a particular kind of sale of Cobalt Strike by Help Systems and distribute it. So it effectively identifies the customer to all intents and purposes. Now, there are lots of watermarks out there that don't make for good kind of ways of clustering activity, because if you've got a cracked sample, the watermark will be false. There's also some that appear to be fairly generic. But in some cases, if we see a small enough number of samples with the same watermark, that can be a pivot for us to try and attribute the activity, particularly when we combine it with other aspects of the configuration that might be the same, like the URL path that's used or the malleable profile or whatever it may be. In this case, when we pivoted on the watermark, we identified a number of other samples communicating with different infrastructure. And at this point, we became aware that some of that infrastructure had previously been attributed by us to a group, a Chinese APT group that we track. And so we're starting to build up a picture of this initial reverse TCP shell activity on a customer was potentially the work of this Chinese APT group we've been tracking for quite some time. And when Mark Bernard, our lead for sort of Chinese threat research, did some more work on this, he was able to actually piece all that together, publish some customer-facing threat intelligence that helps to make sense of what we were seeing. So we're not just gathering indicators and gathering kind of data, we're trying to make sense of that data as well, and then turn that into products that inform our customers as well as protect them. So that's kind of the point of what we're doing with Cobalt Strike. But obviously, one of the reasons for doing that is to develop repeatable ways of doing this for other malware-based threats where we think there is some similar value. So we've already got similar ecosystems running for Covenant, PlugX and ShadowPad, that are two pieces of Chinese malware. The bot emulators use a fairly similar construct, so Quackbot, TrickBot, and others, where we're using TIMs as a kind of orchestration mechanism for pushing data around and processing it before we get it in front of customers. So by doing this, we hope to be able to build up a whole menu of these that we can apply in a sort of template for how we can repeatedly and in a scalable way track these kind of threats without researchers having to spend huge amounts of time moving data around themselves. So to kind of summarize, why do we do this? Well, it requires dedicated resource to do this kind of work. It's not free. It does take researcher time. We have to write the code. We have to go out and write the queries and make sure that the system is running as it should. It's quicker for us than moving data around manually and much more efficient. And crucially, we have a sort of business need to do this. We need to be able to scale. So it's really important for us that we do this. We appreciate that many organizations don't have any dedicated resource to do this kind of thing. We're fortunate that we do. And that's obviously what we try and do for our customers, is provide that scale, provide that resource for them. Orchestration and automation are absolutely crucial. We couldn't do this without the orchestration that Tim's gives us. Automation is required because if we're doing this manually, we're probably too late. We need to be able to do it faster and faster and try and get ahead of the attacker before they start to use the infrastructure that we can identify. So really important that we can orchestrate this stuff in a central way. We're not relying on scripts that exist on someone's machine. This is all managed centrally as kind of a managed code base, which is offers a lot of opportunity for us and a lot of benefits in terms of managing the kind of researcher workload. This kind of feed, these kind of indicators are not a panacea. We all would probably agree that indicators on their own are not sufficient. You need to make sure you've got more enduring countermeasures of the kinds I talked about earlier, sort of behavioral detections. We also know that data feeds are not indicators. As I've tried to stress as we've gone through, we have to apply some logic and some context to them to make sense of them. Otherwise, we're just blindly forwarding on data, which is going to create problems for customers. And customers need to be able to apply them effectively. So, we can do all this work, but ultimately, while we can apply them to the controls we have direct responsibility for, there are some where we need customers to kind of help out by making sure that they're able to then get that data to the place they need it to help protect themselves. But crucially, I think this kind of intelligence does have tactical value. If you can get it delivered fast enough and in an efficient way, it's definitely worth doing and something that we are, as you can see, putting quite a lot of effort into. And it has its place amongst a set of complementary security controls. So, quite a lot of work goes into this kind of thing, but the theory being that we can do this in a way that we can then scale it going forward. That was all I was going to cover. I don't know if we've got time for any questions.
I think we'll probably have a couple, Mike. It's good for me to see you exposing yet another dimension of how we operate our intelligence collection and processing. In effect, orchestrating the researcher playbook. Fortunately, as you say, we're operating at a scale that we can invest in the tools and technology to do that. As you well know, we hold you accountable for making sure we have a good understanding of the threat in Secureworks. How did you go about prioritizing the things that we try and automate here? Is it because we can? Is it prevalence? Is it impact? Is it a combination?
It's a bit of a combination. I think there are some things which just stand out as areas where we need to do this. So Cobalt Strike was a good example where we see it so frequently that we kind of have to do something about it. And everyone's always clamoring for indicators. And as I've said a few times, we recognize that they are sometimes of limited value, but where we can generate them effectively, it's definitely worth us doing it. So some of this is about just identifying the threats that are most prevalent and focusing on those. Some of it's about opportunity. So the PlugX and ShadowPad ones are good examples where we were researching Chinese intrusions against our customer base. And in doing so, I think it was Mark identified that this malware is sometimes returning a sort of standard response, and we can potentially use that as a signature. So part of it is about, if we come across things in our research that provide an opportunity to do it, and it's fairly low effort to do that, then let's get that in there as well, because then we can start to kind of make real benefit and real kind of value from those indicators as well. So it's a bit of a combination. The ones that are more prevalent we'll spend more time on trying to crack because they're the sort of priorities for us, but we're absolutely keen to make sure we pick up the opportunistic ones as well and just try and make our luck, as you often like to say, when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, and Cobalt Strike, obviously, you highlighted in the presentation, we've got comprehensive countermeasures for Cobalt Strike, as well as this work to identify malicious infrastructure. You used to work for the NCSC. Where are you in terms of Cobalt Strike as an offensive security tool? Are you quite happy for it to be there because all these actors are using it, so we can focus our efforts? We can see it, and we don't have to create countermeasures for 100 different tools, or is it just a bad thing that it's there in the first place?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. There's a personal view. There's a difference between tools which are just publicly available on GitHub and work most of the time, might be a bit flaky, maybe they're still developed, maybe they're not, versus a tool which is actively developed under commercial license and is constantly being developed to be harder to detect. that's all well and good as long as the commercial licensing model works well and it's not freely available. The problem with Cobalt Strike and one or two other tools is they've become very easily available to lots of different actors, and that's created real problems for us. So I'm certainly not someone who's going to say people shouldn't develop tools for red teams and shouldn't be kind of sharing knowledge around there. I would point out that in my experience, it's much harder for blue teams to iterate than red teams. So it's harder for network defenders to keep up with some of this stuff than it is for red teams. So I think there's some balance needed. I think it's definitely worth people thinking about some of this stuff before these tools are necessarily made available. But I think with Cobalt Strike, we've just got this difficult challenge of a very, very good tool, which has unfortunately become very available to lots of people who shouldn't have it, and that's creating problems. So it's a difficult challenge. I think, like you say, one of the benefits we have is that you can hunt the thing you know about. It's when you don't know what threat actors are using, it becomes much harder to detect and to write countermeasures for. So there is some benefit there, but unfortunately, Cobalt Strike is so well designed that if it's configured properly, it's still very hard for us to detect.